The United States military, proud service members who make up the greatest fighting force in the world. This tape will highlight 50 great years in American military history, from the biggest battles to the smallest details in the advancement of the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who proudly serve our country. We'll get started where it all began, back in 1775.
The year was 1775. Patriots in America were organizing to overthrow British rule. The result? The Continental Congress authorized the formation of the first American armed forces. George Washington was named Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. 2 battalions of Marines were established, and the first ships were commissioned for the Continental Navy. Organizing a fighting force is one thing, feeding them is another. Typical Army rations of that day included beef or salt fish, bread, cider, and a half pint of milk. While Congress was laying the groundwork for a new nation, American soldiers engaged the British Army in one of the first conflicts of the Revolution, the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Redcoats went on to win this clash, but not before suffering heavy losses.
The year was 1776. It was a year of firsts for the American military as the colonists struggled for freedom. Colonel Elijah Sheldon of Connecticut was appointed commander of a regiment of light dragoons, marking the establishment of the 1st Army Cavalry. Also that year, the first American amphibious assault occurred when Marines landed in the Bahamas and captured 2 British forts. Off the coast of Rhode Island, the Continental Navy had its first engagement with an enemy warship when the American ship Columbus captured the Hawk, an English schooner. In the bitter cold of December, General George Washington and his troops made their way across the Delaware River. They surprised the British forces, taking more than 900 prisoners.
The year was 1777. The American military had been fighting against British rule for 3 years. In a major battle at Saratoga, New York, British General John Burgoyne surrendered. When the news of this victory reached Europe, more financial support poured in to aid Americans in their fight for freedom. In other skirmishes that year, American soldiers used the first mines. They floated kegs of gunpowder down the Delaware River in an attempt to sink a British fleet. Also in 1777, civilian nurses attached to the Continental Army were given a pay raise from $2 a month to $8. And as the year ended, the troops prepared to winter at Valley Forge. The bitter cold made building huts one of the first orders of the day.
The year was 1778, and the American military had entered its 4th year in the Revolutionary War. Major General Baron von Steuben became the Army's first Inspector General, turning the loosely organized militia into a disciplined army. 1778 also saw the Stars and Stripes flown over a foreign stronghold for the first time, after the Americans captured Fort Nassau in the Bahamas. In March of that year, an explosion in the magazine of the Navy frigate Randolph destroyed the ship and cost the lives of 300 sailors. Despite the tragedy, colonists continued to enlist. As an added incentive, men who joined the military received bonuses, not only from the federal government, but from some states as well.
The year was 1783. The United States had won its independence and began downsizing its armed forces. The Continental Navy and Marines were disbanded. The Navy fleet was sold off, except for the warship Alliance. Army ranks were reduced. All officers above the rank of captain were discharged, and the only soldiers retained were those needed to guard public buildings. In New York City, General George Washington delivered a farewell speech to his officers at Fraunces Tavern. And in Massachusetts, Robert Sirtliff was discharged from his regiment. Robert was actually Deborah Sampson, a black woman who masqueraded as a man in order to fight for her nation.
The year was 1798. When the French began seizing U.S. merchant ships, war loomed on the horizon for Americans. General George Washington was recalled to command the Army, and the Navy Department was created. President John Adams appointed Benjamin Stoddert as its first secretary. Included in the new naval fleet was the USS Delaware. That year, her crew received the first prize money awarded for the capture of an enemy vessel. As the United States prepared for war, it wasn't just men joining the ranks. By 1798, military regulations permitted some women to be attached to various regiments. They were usually the wives of NCOs and enlisted men, but they drew rations in return for services such as cooking and cleaning.
The year was 1812. Foreign interference in U.S. shipping led to a call for military action. Congress voted for war with Britain. At that time, the American Navy consisted of only 17 ships. The British Navy had over 1,000. Yet brilliant seamanship by the Americans enabled the USS Constitution to escape from 7 British warships. As the U.S. went to war, the Army was scattered across the nation, trying to keep peace on the new frontier. New Army regulations also came out that year. For the first time, boys 14 to 18 years old were allowed to enlist as musicians. Soldiers were required to wear short hair. And the Army prohibited flogging as a punishment for insubordination or any other infraction.
The year was 1814. America had been involved in the War of 1812 for 2 years as the U.S. military once again was embroiled in a conflict with Britain. Events of 1814 brought honor to America as Brigadier General Winfield Scott and his outnumbered men managed to defeat the British Army in the Battle of Chippewa. The year brought turmoil, too, as British troops occupied Washington and torched the White House and other buildings. President James Madison fled to Maryland, where he became the first president to assume command on the battlefield. Meanwhile, privates were paid $10 a month and received 320 acres of land when their enlistment ended. And the world's first steam-powered warship, the Demologos, was launched in New York City.
The year was 1836. The U.S. military was occupied with peacekeeping operations on the new frontier. Several Army posts had been built along the Mississippi River, providing protection to new settlers. The Second Seminole War was raging in Florida, and the U.S. Navy was called in to prevent gun runners from supplying arms to the Native Americans. In the Southwest, Texans were fighting for their independence from Mexico. After making a heroic stand, they finally lost the Alamo to the Mexican Army. But the U.S. was looking beyond Texas for its boundaries. That year, Congress authorized the Wilkes Expedition, a fleet of 6 naval ships assigned to explore the American coastline, Antarctica, and hundreds of islands in the Pacific. The year was 1842. The U.S. military was exploring new technology as the first underwater mine was tested by Samuel Colt. It successfully sank a schooner and introduced the concept of using electricity to ignite gunpowder. Elsewhere on the seas that year, 3 men were convicted and hanged for the crime of mutiny, even though they never carried out the actual takeover. The USS Somers was the setting for this first and only mutinous event in the U.S. Navy's history. Out west, a landing force of Marines and sailors took over the Mexican town of Monterey. The town was returned to the Mexican government 2 days later with profuse apologies. It seems that Commodore Thomas Jones was mistaken when he thought the U.S. had declared war on Mexico. The year was 1846. After numerous clashes with the Mexican Army, the U.S. finally declared war on Mexico. American naval forces blockaded the eastern coast of Mexico, so not a single Mexican ship put to sea during the war. Back in the States, President James K. Polk called for 50,000 Army volunteers. Enlistments were for 1 year or the duration of the war, instead of the normal 5-year tour. This was also a time when senior officers continued to be promoted on a political basis. President Polk's former law partner, Gideon Pillow, was appointed a major general, although he had no prior military experience. In the Far East, Commodore James Biddle sailed into Tokyo Bay aboard the first U.S. warship to visit Japan.
The year was 1854. American interests abroad were extended as the U.S. military explored new trade routes and signed new treaties. Navy Lieutenant Isaac Strain led an expedition across Panama looking for an Atlantic to Pacific Canal route. Commodore Matthew Perry traveled to Japan and Okinawa on his sidewheel steamship, the USS Mississippi. He signed peace treaties with both nations, opening Japan to the Western world for the first time. Meanwhile, back home, troops began to get new footgear shaped for the left and right feet. Prior to this, shoes were straight and fit either foot. Along with new shoes, privates were now receiving $13 a month. They would not get another pay increase for 51 years.
The year was 1856. The U.S. military was called upon to settle disputes between frontier settlers and Native Americans. In Seattle, Washington, a naval landing party aided settlers when they were attacked by a Yakima tribe numbering more than 1,000. In Nebraska and Wyoming, bands of Sioux were pursued by soldiers until they were forced to surrender and sign a peace treaty with the government. Also that year, Secretary of War Jefferson Davis authorized the purchase of camels for use as pack animals for Army troops in the Southwest. Out in the field, rifled muskets were replacing the smoothbore, giving soldiers better range and accuracy. And the Hardee hat was issued as part of the Army cavalry uniform.
The year was 1861. The U.S. military faced troubled times as the Civil War began. In the first conflict between North and South, the Union's Fort Sumter in South Carolina fell to Confederate forces. Afraid that Maryland would secede, Union officials moved the Naval Academy from Annapolis to Newport, Rhode Island. That same year, the two armies met at Manassas, Virginia, to fight in the First Battle of Bull Run. Creative battle strategies were to make a difference during the war. Thaddeus Lowe, a civilian balloonist, developed a successful way to observe Confederate batteries. He ascended in a tethered balloon and kept a watchful eye on the enemy. And by year's end, the Army began using a retirement system for officers that is still used today.
The year was 1862. The Civil War was in its second year with bloody battles at Shiloh, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. At sea, the first battle between ironclad ships, the Monitor and the Virginia, took place near Norfolk, Virginia. The vision of both captains was obscured by gunsmoke, and both left the encounter thinking they'd won. Congress was also busy. They passed the Pension Act, which provided pensions to servicemen disabled in the line of duty. Out in the ranks, the unit badge evolved when the men of the 3rd Division, 3rd Corps, began wearing a piece of scarlet cloth on their uniforms. That same year, a civilian agency called the Sanitary Commission began recruiting female nurses to care for Union soldiers. Volunteers had to be over 30 and of good moral standards.
The year was 1863. Major Civil War battles were fought at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, with the Confederates losing both encounters. Off the coast of South Carolina, Rear Admiral Samuel DuPont's fleet attacked Charleston, the most heavily defended port in the Confederacy, but was unsuccessful. Back on land, the Army Signal Corps made its debut, becoming the first signal corps in the world to exist as a separate unit. And in the cavalry, some units received the Spencer 7-shot carbine, one of the first repeaters used in the Army. For those with alternate career plans, the Enrollment Act of 1863 was very popular. It allowed any man who was drafted and didn't want to enter the service to hire a substitute or buy an exemption for $300.
The year was 1866. With the Civil War over, the reunited U.S. military was called into action overseas. In China, an American consul was assaulted, and a party of U.S. Marines and sailors was sent ashore to seize the bandits responsible for the attack. Back home, Congress created the new Navy rank of Admiral and conferred it upon David Farragut in recognition of his service during the Civil War. Also promoted was Ulysses S. Grant, who became the first Army general with a 4-star rank. The same year, Congress voted a 100% pay raise for itself, while slashing the pay for military personnel. And post-traders were allowed to operate on military installations. This practice eventually led to the present-day post exchanges. The year was 1898, and Cuba asked the U.S. military for help in its fight for independence from Spain. The USS Maine was sent to Havana Harbor. When the battleship exploded and sank, Spain was held responsible, and Americans went to war. During the fight, the U.S. cavalry was unable to make landfall on Cuba and had to lower their horses overboard. On shore, a bugler played music to guide the confused horses to dry land. the animals made it, enabling Lieutenant Colonel Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders to storm up Kettle Hill. While in Cuba, the military made great advances in communications when the U.S. Army Signal Corps used field telephones for the first time. That year also saw the first official campaign medal authorized for those who fought in the Battle of Manila Bay.
The year was 1900. In the Philippines, insurgent forces were trying to overthrow the government, and American troops were utilized to stop the revolt. In China, the Boxer Rebellion erupted, and U.S. Marines were called upon to defend the American embassy in Peking. That same year, the United States took formal possession of Wake Island to serve as a cable station between Manila and Hawaii. As the U.S. expanded its territories in the Pacific, the Navy's capabilities also expanded. In 1900, the Navy received its first modern submarine, the USS Holland. In New York City, the Army Relief Society was founded. Its purpose? To provide advice and financial assistance to Army widows and orphans.
The year was 1908, and the U.S. military was modernizing and growing. Compensation was increasing. Privates received $15 a month. Master sergeants brought in $45, while second lieutenants earned more than $141 per month. That year, the Navy Nurse Corps was established. 1908 also marked the start of military aviation as the Wright brothers signed the first Army airplane contract. On the seas, the U.S. Navy demonstrated its sea power with the Great White Fleet, the first American ships to circumnavigate the globe. 16 bright white steam-powered battleships sailed to ports including Yokohama, Japan, and Gibraltar. Closer to home, the Panama Canal was under construction by the Army Corps of Engineers.
The year was 1909. The United States military was beginning to expand into areas of exploration and aviation. In the frozen Arctic, Navy Commander Robert Peary's expedition reached the North Pole on the third attempt. Back in the States, the Wright brothers delivered the Army's first airplane. Its test flight set a two-man record, flying for more than an hour. Later that year, Lieutenant Frank Humphreys performed the Army's first solo flight for 3 minutes and 3 seconds. Also in 1909, plans were begun to build a naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Congress, meanwhile, was preoccupied with the Marine Corps. It passed legislation that stipulated that the Corps would receive no funds unless Marines continued to serve aboard Navy ships.
The year was 1910. The U.S. military was reaching new heights in aviation and naval strength. All earlier battleships were now obsolete as the USS Michigan became the first commissioned American dreadnought with heavy armor plate and 12-inch guns. It was also the first year of Navy flight training when Lieutenant Theodore Ellison attended the Glenn Curtiss Aviation School in San Diego. Since the Army had not yet set up its own flight school, its aviators went to the Wright Flying School in Montgomery, Alabama. Operated by Orville Wright, it later became Maxwell Field. Meanwhile, a Curtiss biplane took off from a wooden platform on the Navy cruiser Birmingham, marking the first shipboard takeoff.
The year was 1911. It was a year of military aviation firsts. In College Park, Maryland, the U.S. Army opened its first aviation school. And at the San Francisco Air Meet, Army Lieutenant Paul Beck dropped the first live bomb from an aircraft after designing the device himself. Also in California, Army Lieutenant George Kelly made the first photo reconnaissance flight when he tried to photograph troops on the ground. The mission was unsuccessful, however, as the soldiers were in a wooded area under trees. Meanwhile, the Navy ordered its first airplanes and qualified its first aviator. The same year, pilot Eugene Ely landed the first aircraft aboard a ship, setting down on a specially built platform on the USS Pennsylvania.
The year was 1916. The country's mood was unsettled as the U.S. military kept an eye on World War I. President Woodrow Wilson wanted the Navy to equal any other in the world, so Congress passed the Naval Act of 1916, authorizing almost $500 million for a 3-year building program. As part of its expansion, the Navy Department called for the establishment of the first West Coast Marine Corps base. As the U.S. military was expanding, it was also strengthening its fighting power. In 1916, both the Army and Navy ordered machine guns to be mounted on military aircraft. It was also the year that General John Pershing and his men crossed the Mexican border in pursuit of Pancho Villa, a bandit who was killing Americans.
The year was 1917. The United States declared war on Germany and entered World War I. The first American troops landed in France, with General John Pershing's insistence that they operate as a separate command. Also arriving in France was the Rainbow Division, made up entirely of National Guard units. During this year, the Selective Service Act was passed and enrolled more than 9 million men. By the end of the war, nearly 3 million had been called upon to serve. The Navy also enlisted women to fill clerical jobs for the first time. They were affectionately called yeomanettes. Congress raised a new private's pay to $1 a day, and the cost of outfitting a doughboy for the front was $156.30.
The year was 1918, and the American military was committed to winning World War I. The fierce battles brought out many acts of courage. To honor bravery in action, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army Distinguished Service Medal, and the Silver Citation Star were authorized. Meanwhile, Army pilots inaugurated the government's first airmail service, and the U.S. Army created the Tank Corps. These tanks were used in the final major attack along the Hindenburg Line. With more than 1 million American troops involved, the operation was a decisive success. On November 11th, in a railroad car outside of Paris, officials signed the armistice that ended World War I.
The year was 1919. The United States military was recuperating from World War I. As part of the healing process, the American Legion was formed as a veterans organization for all those who served. The same year, a Navy crew made the first transatlantic flight in a Curtiss flying boat. The crew logged 57 flying hours, covering a distance of nearly 4,000 miles. The Navy also authorized the construction of its first rigid airship, the Shenandoah. But the Navy wasn't the only one up in the air that year. The first military parachute jump was made using a backpack chute, the ancestor of all Army parachutes. After World War I, the War Department ordered the use of a national star on American military planes.
The year was 1922. The U.S. military was traveling to all parts of the globe protecting American interests on foreign soil. When political tensions mounted in Nicaragua, the USS Galveston landed a detachment of Marines at Corinto to help guard the American embassy. Marine detachments also reinforced the embassy guard in Peking amid the disorders of Chinese Civil War. While in the Mediterranean, American destroyers assisted in the evacuation of 250,000 Greeks who were expelled from Asia Minor after Turkey won the Greco-Turkish War. And Navy pilots made the first successful takeoffs, catapult launches, and landings on the USS Langley, a coal ship that was converted into the Navy's first aircraft carrier.
The year was 1924. Aviation was becoming increasingly important to the U.S. military as aircraft technology continued to advance. Parachutes became required use for all personnel on Navy aircraft, and 4 Army Douglas biplanes took off from Seattle with 2-man crews to begin the first military flight around the world. The one plane that actually completed the trip logged 363 flying hours, but the trip took nearly 6 months. Overseas, the U.S. Marines were called into action when a native tribe revolted in the southern Philippines. And 1924 was also the year Brigadier General Billy Mitchell predicted the possibility of a Japanese air attack on Pearl Harbor. The Army commander in Hawaii called the prediction ignorant. The year was 1926, and the U.S. military was involved in exploration and internal changes. Searching for the North Pole, Navy Lieutenant Commander Richard Byrd and Chief Aviation Pilot Floyd Bennett were among the first to explore the Arctic region by air. While the Navy was using aircraft for exploration, Colonel Billy Mitchell was pushing to develop air power in the Army. After meeting resistance from Army brass, Colonel Mitchell resigned. Later, World War II would confirm many of his predictions. In another unusual development, President Calvin Coolidge assigned U.S. Marines to guard the mail after a rash of robberies occurred in a number of cities around the country. And that year, Army uniforms underwent a major change. Collared blouses were issued and ties became a requirement.
The year was 1929, and aviation continued to grow in importance to the American military. Recognizing its potential, Congress authorized the construction of the first aircraft carrier, the USS Ranger. Prior to this, ships were converted to serve as carriers. Advanced technology also enabled the first blind flight to be made, with the pilot depending entirely on instruments for takeoff, level flight, and landing. That same year, Navy Lieutenant Commander Richard Byrd made the first flight over the South Pole, taking aerial photos to map the route. And after a severe drought, the city of Tacoma, Washington lost its water-dependent electrical power. The U.S. Navy stepped in and used a steamship in Puget Sound to furnish power to the entire city for 30 days.
The year was 1940. Because of war in Europe, the U.S. military was strengthening its ranks. For the very first time, the U.S. faced a peacetime draft with passage of the Selective Training and Service Act. This allowed for draft quotas as well as the training of draftees. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, Congress was asked to authorize funding to effectively double the size of the Navy. In addition, the military received enough money to significantly increase fighter plane production. That year, U.S. intelligence agencies decoded the top-secret Japanese diplomatic code, giving Americans an advantage. Ironically, at the same time, a U.S. Navy code word became declassified. It seemed the term radar had become commonplace.
The year was 1941. The U.S. military was keeping its distance from the European conflict and was busy reorganizing. That year, the Army Air Forces was formed under Major General Hap Arnold. Then, on December 7th, Japanese aircraft attacked the U.S. naval fleet in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 19 American warships were lost, 188 planes destroyed, and more than 2,400 Americans were killed. Among those who died was Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd. He was the highest-ranking naval officer to be killed during all of World War II. In response to the attack, the United States declared war on Japan. On the mainland, the Declaration of Independence was moved from Washington to Fort Knox for safekeeping.
The year was 1942. It was the U.S. military's first full year in World War II, with ferocious battles being waged in places like Midway, Guadalcanal, and North Africa. It was also the year the Joint Chiefs of Staff was established. Women took on a military role as the War Department set up the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, and the Navy created the Waves, women accepted for volunteer emergency service. Out in the Pacific, Army Air Forces Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led the first U.S. air raid on Japan, with 16 B-25 bombers operating from the aircraft carrier Hornet. And during the Battle of the Coral Sea, the U.S. stopped the Japanese advance on Australia. It was the first naval encounter fought strictly with aircraft.
The year was 1944, and the U.S. military was contributing to Allied victories during World War II. In Europe, Operation Overlord was launched on June 6th, known as D-Day. The Allies landed troops on the beaches of Normandy and proceeded to push back German forces. Later that year, the Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last major counteroffensive. The U.S. and Allied forces were not only victorious, but the battle effectively exhausted the German reserves. In the Pacific, U.S. forces continued to sweep through islands, including Guam and Saipan, defeating the Japanese forces and pushing closer to Japan. And to show its support, Congress passed the GI Bill that year, providing benefits for all returning servicemen.
The year was 1945. The U.S. military had been fighting World War II on two fronts. But with the fall of Berlin, the German High Command finally surrendered to the Allies. In the Pacific, U.S. Marines landed on Iwo Jima, about 750 miles from Tokyo. They fought savage opposition for a month before taking the island. This led to the invasion of Okinawa, the biggest battle of the Pacific. After bitter fighting, this island on Japan's doorstep fell to the Americans. Then in August, the U.S. Army Air Forces dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was the first and last military use of the atomic bomb. The result? Japan surrendered, bringing an end to World War II.
The year was 1947. The U.S. military began to reorganize as aviation reached supersonic speeds. President Harry Truman signed the National Security Act of 1947, placing all the armed services under the Secretary of Defense. The Department of the Air Force was formed as a separate service, and the 1st Marine Corps Jet Fighter Squadron was established at Cherry Point, North Carolina. In California, the Air Force flew its first swept-wing fighter, which became the first operational aircraft to go supersonic. While over the Mojave Desert, the experimental Bell XS-1 produced the first recorded sonic boom. Great technological strides were also made below sea level, as a guided missile was fired from a submarine for the first time.
The year was 1949, and the U.S. military opened up the skies as spaceflight became a reality. The Army launched the first recorded man-made object into outer space, a 2-stage rocket from White Sands that traveled 244 miles straight up. And staying within the atmosphere, the Lucky Lady 2, a B-50 bomber, made the first non-stop round-the-world flight, refueling in midair 4 times and flying more than 23,000 miles. In another aviation first, Navy Lieutenant Jack Fruin ejected from his aircraft at 575 miles per hour. It was the first use of an ejection seat for an emergency escape. Also that year, the Air Force switched uniform colors from olive green to blue.
The year was 1950. After a period of peace, the U.S. military found itself once again on the brink of war. North Korean communist forces invaded South Korea, and President Harry Truman sent U.S. forces to South Korea's aid. The United Nations became involved in the conflict and named General Douglas MacArthur as the commander-in-chief of its forces. After nearly being defeated, UN forces recaptured Seoul and pressed into North Korea, almost destroying the North Korean army. Over the Yalu River, the first jet versus jet dogfight occurred when an American F-80 shot down a Chinese MiG. During that year, pay for a private was $75 a month, and the Articles of War were revised to become the Uniform Code of Military Justice.
The year was 1954. The U.S. military was involved in a different kind of conflict, the Cold War against communism. Under a joint Canadian-American military command, contractors began planning the Distant Early Warning, or DEW line. It was designed to detect hostile aircraft approaching over the North Pole. In the Pacific, the U.S. exploded a hydrogen bomb on Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. And President Dwight Eisenhower ordered the Navy to provide support to the nationalist Chinese forces defending themselves against Communist China. Back in the States, the Army activated its first helicopter battalion at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And the Marines proudly dedicated the Iwo Jima Memorial in Arlington, Virginia.
The year was 1955, and it was a year of firsts for the U.S. military. The first nuclear-powered submarine, the Nautilus, began trials. In Norfolk, Virginia, the aircraft carrier USS Forrestal was commissioned, the first since World War II, and the first built with an angled flight deck. That year, the first B-52s entered operational service with the Air Force. And Operation Deep Freeze started as the U.S. military began building permanent facilities in Antarctica for scientific study. And military officials responded to criticism resulting from the Korean War by establishing the Military Code of Conduct. It was designed to govern the actions of Americans in battle and as prisoners of war.
The year was 1958. Terms like Cold War, arms race, and space race dominated American lives. It was the year the Air Force launched its first Atlas missile, and the Army put the first American satellite in space. Explorer 1 revealed important information about cosmic rays and meteor particles and aided in the discovery of the Van Allen belts. It was the same year the Navy's nuclear submarine, the Nautilus, crossed the North Pole beneath the ice cap for the first time. And unknown servicemen killed in World War II and the Korean War were given an honorable place of burial at Arlington National Cemetery. American forces were also overseas, as United States Marines were sent to Lebanon to help keep peace during national elections.
The year was 1959. The United States was embroiled in the arms race, while military technology continued to achieve the impossible. The first free flight of the X-15 was made, which bridged the gap between manned atmospheric flight and space travel. And the longest recorded parachute descent was made by Marine Lieutenant Colonel William Rankin. After ejecting from his plane at 47,000 feet, Rankin was caught in thermal updrafts in a thunderstorm and was kept in the air for almost 40 minutes. Closer to Earth, the first ballistic missile submarine, the USS George Washington, was launched, carrying nuclear warheads and driven by nuclear propulsion. Also that year, the last of the Civil War veterans died. Walter Williams had been a private in the Confederate 5th Cavalry.
The year was 1962. The United States military was increasing its involvement in Vietnam as well as exploring space. Marine Lieutenant Colonel John Glenn, in Friendship 7, became the first American to orbit the Earth. Back home, President John F. Kennedy revealed the Soviet buildup in Cuba. After he ordered a naval blockade of the island, the Soviets removed their missiles. Meanwhile, the Air Force was experimenting with unconventional tactics of its own. In Vietnam, U.S. aircraft sprayed the powerful defoliant Agent Orange over jungle trails used by the Viet Cong. It was also the year the Navy created the Specialized SEAL Team, operating on sea, air, and land, and trained in unconventional warfare.
The year was 1964. The United States military presence in Vietnam continued to increase. With it came new advances in military aviation. President Lyndon Johnson announced the successful development of the SR-71 Strategic Reconnaissance Aircraft, which could fly at Mach 3+. And the XB-70 Valkyrie bomber made its first test flight. Only 2 were built before the program was scrapped in favor of ICBMs. In the thick of the action, the Navy destroyer Maddox was attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. And the first U.S. airstrikes by Navy aircraft were made on North Vietnam. 2 planes were lost during the mission, with one of the pilots, Lieutenant J.G. Everett Alvarez, becoming the first Navy POW in North Vietnam.
The year was 1968. American military advisors had been in Vietnam for more than 8 years, with American troops involved in the fighting for the last 3. The USS New Jersey, the world's only active battleship, arrived off Vietnam and opened fire on targets in the DMZ. Farther south, the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, a series of major attacks throughout South Vietnam. Elsewhere in the Pacific, North Koreans captured the Pueblo, a U.S. intelligence ship in the Sea of Japan. Its crew underwent harsh treatment until released later in the year. And in the more peaceful environs of space, Navy Captain James Lovell, Air Force Colonel Frank Borman, and Lieutenant Colonel William Anders took to new heights as the first men to orbit the moon.
The year was 1972. The U.S. military was withdrawing from active participation in the Vietnam War. The Navy's last in-country combat unit and the last U.S. combat troops were withdrawn. Direct military participation on the ground ended, although there were still about 29,000 American soldiers remaining in South Vietnam. During this time, 2 Navy flyers became the first aces of the Vietnam War, making their 5th enemy kills. And in 1972, President Richard Nixon announced that the draft would come to an end the following year. In the passing of another era, the United States also announced that it was returning Okinawa to Japan after occupying the island since World War II.
The year was 1983. The American military was kept busy protecting U.S. citizens and interests around the world from terrorists and rebels. In an effort to eliminate the threat of ICBMs, President Ronald Reagan announced the Star Wars anti-ballistic missile program. That year, the U.S. military was sent to the small island of Grenada in the Caribbean. The troops were called in to evacuate American students after a pro-communist group murdered the country's leader. Threats to American security interests in the Middle East caused the United States to activate the U.S. Central Command. And in Beirut, Lebanon, a terrorist drove a truckload of explosives into the U.S. Marine Corps compound, killing 220 Marines.
The year was 1990, and the Cold War was over. The United States signed the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty to significantly reduce arms in Europe. The Department of Defense projected additional force reductions and planned to retire 54 Navy ships. While the military was downsizing, trouble overseas was escalating. American troops in Panama brought President Manuel Noriega to the U.S. to be tried on drug charges. In Liberia, rebels struck the capital and took foreign hostages. U.S. Marines were sent to protect the embassy and evacuate American civilians. And by year's end, Iraq invaded Kuwait and threatened Saudi Arabia. Operation Desert Shield soon began by rushing more than 400,000 U.S. troops to the area.
The year was 1991. The U.S. military underwent changes as the breakup of the Soviet Union created 15 newly independent nations. President George Bush had Strategic Air Command units stand down after nearly 35 years of being on continuous alert. After Iraq annexed Kuwait, more than 600,000 Allied troops from 28 nations met in Saudi Arabia to wage war. Operation Desert Storm proved the power of cruise missiles, stealth aircraft, and smart bombs. U.S. troops quickly took out most of the Iraqi command structure, while B-52 raids disabled many Iraqi weapons. Coalition ground forces defeated the Iraqi army in 4 days, and Iraq retreated from Kuwait.
From the Revolution to the Civil War, through 2 world wars, to Desert Storm. Humble beginnings that grew into today's elite fighting forces. You've just witnessed some of the major steps in that advancement. We hope you've enjoyed this edition of 50 Great Years in American Military History.